Tenacious coders, this is Prof G, and buckle up for big learning. We're going to tackle pushy spacers, custom colors, curvy corner radii, and show how to add a background color to your app. We sneak into the safe area and learn to stop the SafeArea color bleed quirk, all with a layer of ZStack, opacity, and gradient goodness. It's a veritable buffet of app design skills, tips, and tricks, so let's learn big. If you're new here, welcome. You might want to check out the course playlist to see how we got here. Now, this is where we left off at the end of our previous lesson, and we've been working with VStacks, HStacks, and frames, and various methods to align and orient items in our views. And since we're working with layouts, a quick reminder about the spacer view. A spacer will take up all of the available horizontal or vertical space available in a view. Just after the text view code, and before the start of the HStack, I'm going to type in spacer with a capital S and empty parens after it, and we'll see that this spacer takes up a maximum amount of space to push the text to the top and the buttons to the bottom of the device. Nice! Now a quick aside, on this device, you might notice that we didn't reach the very top or the bottom. That's because Apple uses what's called a safe area by default. Now on devices with a notch or an island, the safe area runs from just under the notch or the island, and just above the space at the bottom that would be obscured if you're on an iPhone that has a curved screen. Now just to show you, if I switch the preview to the iPhone SE 3rd generation, this device doesn't have a curved screen and it doesn't have a notch. So the screen corners are rectangles. You see there's no safe area at the bottom, so the buttons touch the very bottom. Now the gap that we have at the top is because we have some padding around our frame, but there's also a bit of space for what's called the status bar in the iPhone. That's where you display things like time indicators for signal strength, Wi-Fi, and battery life. Now I think the HStack that encloses the buttons is too close to the bottom of the device, so I'm just going to add a padding modifier to the end of the HStack. That gives me a nice little button gap. Looks much better. And you know, I'd also like the buttons to be spread out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a spacer in between the two buttons inside of the HStack. And look at that, the buttons move to the edges. So the padding around the HStack looks much better than when it was removed. Now also remember we can use multiple spacers, and each spacer will take up an equal portion of the available space on screen. For example, if we had another spacer as the first view in the VStack, just above the text view, we see the text view is pushed to the middle of the VStack. Looking good. Now check this out. If we want the text to be 1/3 of the way down from the top, we could add a third spacer below the text. And now we have one spacer on the top and two on the bottom. And what happens is the spacers divide up the available space to occupy the amount of free space on the view. So we have 3 spacers. Each one takes up 1/3 of the space available. 1/3 on the top, 2/3 for the 2 spacers on the bottom. And if we had a 4th spacer below the 2 below the text is now in the top quarter of the screen. And this would resize to any device, placing the text roughly where you want it to be relative to the size available. So these spacers are really pushy. They work vertically and horizontally, and they push views around, taking up as much space as possible, but that's pushy in a good way. Now let's talk about colors, and we'll start by pointing out a quirk in SwiftUI and how color bleeds into the navigation area, and I'll offer some advice on how to fix this if you'd like. But before doing that, I'm going to remove 2 of the spacers that I just added, so I only have one below the text and one above it, and let's switch preview so that we're looking at an iPhone with an island. And I'm going to add a new text view up top just for demonstration purposes, so after the VStack, I'll enter text parens double quotes, you have skills, and then below that I'll add modifiers .font type .large title and .font weight of type .black. And black is an old typographer term. It does not imply color. It just implies the boldest thickness you can get. Now we'll set this font's color with a .foreground style modifier, setting it to .white. So we've got a white colored font, which we don't see on the white background. We'll see it in a bit with the black thickness. But now for the quirk. Watch what happens to the area up here by the sensor housing or the notch when I set the dot background to, how about dot purple? And this is what I mean by the color bleeding through. It doesn't just surround the text frame, it bleeds right into the notch in the status bar. Now we could overwrite the notch area with different colors, but that's more of an advanced topic. But I think what folks are going to want to do most of the time is just stop this background from spilling into the safe area. And there are a few ways to do this. And before I show the technique, I'll add some padding before the background color to add some purple padding around the text. We still get the bleed through. Now one way to stop this is to add a very small amount of padding. So here I'll add 1 point of padding. And hey, we see the color doesn't bleed into the safe area. And by the way, you can't unfortunately set padding to 0. The color still bleeds through. But sometimes you don't even want 1 point of padding. So another technique is to add a cornerRadius of 0. Let me show you. First, I'm going to delete this 1 point of padding. Now you might see some older lessons that refer to using a .cornerRadius modifier, but if you try to enter that, you can see that code completion says cornerRadius is being deprecated, use clipShape instead. So let's add .clipShape instead. Whoops, I accidentally code folded, didn't mean to do that. But here's clipShape. Select the top option with just the shape. This says it sets a clipping shape for the view. Except this, and clipShape wants a shape. Why don't we give it a rounded rectangle? You get a couple options in here, and one of them has cornerRadius. So select this. From high school geometry, the radius is half the diameter, but more importantly, in Swift design, the radius is the number of points it takes to make a 90-degree turn. So let's try this out. Here's 15, a very noticeable curve. But even more noteworthy, once the cornerRadius modifier is on, the bleeding into the SafeArea stops. Ho-ho! Well, let's try a cornerRadius of 30, an even more noticeable curve. And here's a tip from Prof G. Put in a cornerRadius of 0, and you get no curve, but no bleeding into the SafeArea. Quirky iOS behavior? Corrected. Comment the cornerRadius out, and you see the color bleed into the SafeArea resumes. So feel free to experiment with this. Now you've got full control over the SafeArea, and you're ready to stay safe, Swifter. And I'll set the cornerRadius to 15 for the remainder of this lesson. Now let's talk colors. Well, we know the SwiftUI has built-in colors that we can access with dot notation, and these are great, but sometimes you want something that Swift can't offer. For example, let's say you want a nice sky blue for a weather app. Well, Swift has dot blue, indigo, teal, but none of these really cuts it. And there's no light blue or sky blue. And you might remember when we discussed dark mode that we showed ways to create a custom color. First, let's open the navigator pane and click on Assets Catalog. Now to create a custom color, I could click on this plus sign in the lower left-hand corner and select Color Set, but I could also two-finger click anywhere inside the Asset Catalog pane. The context menu comes up and I'll select New Color Set here. Either way, same result. Then open the Inspectors pane at the right and select the Attributes Inspector. And now by default, you see that there are two boxes in the center where you set up your color. Now we've already learned that we can have two colors, including one that prioritizes dark mode, but here I just want to have one color. So under Appearances here, pull down this selection and select None. And we see now there's only one box that says Universal. And now let's create that color. So click the Universal box and notice the Attribute Inspector changes. Yours might look slightly different depending on what your content and your input method is, but regardless, you should have a button that says Show Color Panel, so let's click that. And this brings up the standard Mac color picker. And in the color picker tab, I'm going to click the pencils on the right. This one is turquoise, not quite what I want. Here's ice. Still not right, but it's a good start. So I can use this as a good start. I'll click the ice pencil and we see that the color shows up in the larger square in the lower left. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to click the wheel on the left-hand side of the toolbar to refine my color. And I can click and drag this little circle to choose a color I want. And as I drag around, I see the square in the lower left contains the selected color that's underneath my cursor. And once you see a color that you like, release your mouse. I think this is good. And so that's our custom color selected from the color picker. And you'll want to name this color. So double click the generic color name and change it. I'm going to call this sky blue in upper camel case, capital S, capital B, no space in between. You want to remember how you spelled that. And next, let me show you how to create an asset catalog custom color using the RGB or red, green, blue values. Over 65,000 colors can be indicated by how much red, green, and blue you want in a color. The individual RGB values can be numbers from 0 to 1, or I think more commonly you'll see numbers from 0 to 255. You also might see them in 3 sets of hexadecimal numbers. Those are 00 through FF, that's base 16. So if you found a color online and wanted to use this, or if you were given the RGB values for a specific corporate color to use, here's how you'd set that color up. So create a new color, two-finger click in the list of assets, select New Color Set, and I'll once again go to the Appearances attribute and select None. Then I'll click on my single color square and look at the bottom of the Attributes Inspector. The Input Method pull-down indicates how you can enter a color. Mine is hexadecimal right now. Yours might be different, but pull down the Input Method and select 8-bit 0 to 255. And we can enter the RGB numbers right here. So in our example, let's imagine that I wanted to use the color vermilion that I found online by doing a search for vermilion RGB, and I like this color. Now there are a few different standards for color names, so you might see different numbers for the same color names. Right here I've got 227, 66, and 52. So I'm going to return to Xcode, enter these values, and voila! I've got my vermilion. Comparison to what I found looks great, so I'm going to name this color as vermilion with a capital V. Finally, there's a way to set up and name a custom color that's a perfect match for a color that you've got on your computer. Maybe it's part of a logo or an image or a page that you found online. So in this example, I'll create a custom maroon and gold color. Those are the official colors of my university where I teach. And what I've done is I've pulled up an official university page here. This is the page for the Schiller Institute of Integrated Sciences at Boston College. Phil Schiller, by the way, is a Boston College alumnus and one of Apple's most legendary executives. He'd often appear on stage with Steve Jobs and Tim Cook as the first person to introduce a new iPhone model. He'd very graciously invited my students out to watch the launch of the iPhone and a bunch of other Apple product launches. Bragging rights aside, well, if I want to use the maroon and gold from this page, here's what I do. I'm going to return to the asset catalog in Xcode, create a new color set, set its appearance to none, and then with a blank square selected, I'm going to click Show Color Panel, and I'm going to use this eyedropper tool that you see in the lower left of the color picker. Now before I click that, I'm first going to shrink the Xcode screen so that I can see the browser page in back that contains the colors I want. Then I'll click the eyedropper tool. I'll move it on top of the maroon color. See how it's magnified under my cursor? I'm going to click there, and then I can see the maroon color I just selected in the box in the lower left of the color picker. And I can drag this into the right for easy access in the color picker later on if I ever want to do that. And I can also see the RGB values are determined for me automatically if I ever need those. Nice! I'm going to name this maroon-BC, and I'm going to perform the exact same steps to select the gold color, and I'll name that gold-BC. And now that I've got all of these custom colors, let me return to the content view by selecting that file in the project navigator, and we'll see how we can use these colors in our code. So first I'll set the background color. I'm going to replace the purple color, which is standard, and watch what happens if I use dot notation and start to type sky blue. Xcode may alter the name of the color slightly. We call this sky blue in upper camel case. Here it's showing sky blue in lower camel case, but I'm going to select that, and we have our nice sky blue background. Nothing but blue skies for your Swift skill. And now here's another way that we can access our custom colors. First, I'll close the attribute inspector and adjust my preview, and I'll delete sky blue from the background modifier. And now let's open the library. Remember, that's the plus icon in the upper right of Xcode. And go to the color icon in the library toolbar. It looks like an artist's palette, and all of your custom colors are here. By the way, the default accent color is shown here. It's blue by default here, but it's also listed in the assets catalog, so you can change it there. And also, if you change a color in the assets catalog, that change will show up any place you refer to the same color name. So one of the advantages of using a custom color in the asset catalog is if you call your color something more generic, like primary app color or color 1, and then you or your designers decide to change the color, you only need to change it once in the asset catalog, and the update is applied everywhere that color name shows up in your code. You can't change the name, so choose a good name right from the start, but any asset catalog changes that refer to that color name will happen when you make the change. So drag over one of your custom colors. I'm going to choose Maroon BC, drop it in between the parens of the background modifier, and blam! The color is inserted, and I see it in the preview. Tremendous! Now this shows you yet another way to enter colors. It's using color, which is the name of the view. See the capital C in there, and then between parentheses you enter the string of the color exactly as it's listed in the asset catalog. I prefer dot notation, but now you know many ways to get at a custom color. I'll do the same in foreground color, replacing the existing color with dot gold BC from dot notation. And look at that, maroon and gold. Nice! I'm also going to comment out the border modifiers that I'm using on the text view and the H-stack that surrounds the buttons. Those were just for demonstration purposes. And just a quick reminder of the difference between dot background and dot tint. The term background applies to items that aren't interactive. So if I apply the background modifier to the H-stack here and then set this color to the custom color vermilion that we just created in the asset catalog, the entire background of the H-stack is changed. But if I replace background with the modifier tint, then that changes the tint of interactive items that are inside of this H-stack view. So since buttons are interactive, you can press them, their tint color changes. This will also change the tint color of other interactive views like the switch control, and we'll introduce more controls later on in this course. But be aware the background modifier is pretty much for static items like background views, while tint is used to color interactive items that the user touches. Now I don't really want to change the tint here, so I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to scroll up to the top and I'll demonstrate how you can set the background of the entire screen. Now, there are a bunch of ways that you can color the background of a screen in SwiftUI. I'll show you two of the most popular, one with ZStack and one with background. Now, we mentioned when we first saw this term that while VStacks stack views vertically and HStacks stack views horizontally, the ZStacks stacks views one on top of another. Now, the first view listed in a ZStack is at the bottom, so if we put a color in the back of the ZStack or list it first and put everything else on top of it, we've effectively colored the screen. So let's try it. I'm going to command click on VStack and then select embed in ZStack, and I'll also fold the VStack code so that I can focus in on the ZStack, and we see the ZStack is outside of everything. Now, colors can also be used as views in SwiftUI. Let me show you. First, know that we can't enter dot and then a legitimate color name like dot yellow here. AI is recommending yellow BC. I don't know where I got that from, but we don't even have that in this app. Also note that views all start with capital letters. Capital Z ZStack, capital V VStack, capital T text, capital S spacer, HStack, and button are also capitalized. Well, if I want to enter a color as a view, I can enter capital C color, and then dot, and then since Xcode now knows that I want a color in here, I can use dot notation to find any of the SwiftUI predefined colors. So if I say dot yellow, my background becomes the Swift standard mustard yellow. Well, all right. Now we're seeing this color everywhere except for the safe area. The color isn't in the top of the screen, that's where the status bar is. It also won't overwrite the home indicator, that's the horizontal swipe line at the bottom of iPhones that don't have a home button. Now what if we want the color to go into the safe area? Sometimes we want that. We'll just add this modifier to color, .ignoreSafeArea with parens after it. And this puts the background behind everything, even behind the icon text and indicators that would be in the status view. Nice! Now just to show you, you could cut ignoreSafeArea out from under color and instead put that modifier underneath the ZStack, but this would be bad. Take a look. Since it tells everything inside the ZStack to ignore the safe area, we see that the views at the top and the bottom are pushed into the safe area. Not what we want. So I'll undo that and keep ignoreSafeArea underneath the color. So ZStack can be easy to read. Objects are back to front listed top to bottom, but some folks don't like the fact that it creates another indent level. So if you want background that ignores a safe area like this, we can also use a background modifier instead. Let's delete the color in ZStack above and the closing curly for the ZStack below. And I'll fix my VStack indent. And whoops, I open my code and let me get this sorted. And I'll fold the VStack because this is the view that I want to modify. We want to add a background to the outermost view. That is the VStack. So below the VStack closing curly, I'm going to enter dot background, and within the empty parens, I'm going to enter any color that I want to fill in the entire background, including the safe area. We'll try dot yellow, and this is looking good. So this is a bit more compact. You don't have the extra ZStack indent. You save a few lines of code. This is good when you want a color to fill in the entire screen, ignoring the safe areas, which is usually what you want to do with a full view background color. Now, we'll also show you a quick hack to tweak the background color. If you like the color of your background, but you think it would look better if it were washed out a bit, you can hack this quickly with the opacity modifier, dot opacity right after the color name. This sets the transparency of a view, and when applied to a color background, it makes the color seem softer or whiter. Now, opacity value of 1 is fully opaque, so you don't see any change. A value of 0 is fully transparent, meaning it's invisible. But if I pass in 0.5 in between parens, I see the color becomes muted. It's not as garish as the original yellow. Cool. But be careful with opacity, because if there's something behind the color, then that color will bleed through. For example, let's see how it looks if you've got a light foreground color that's on a dark background color. That's what we've got with the "You have skills" text in the text view. So if I set the opacity of the text's foreground style, that's the gold BC color here, with dot opacity passing in 0.5. Instead of fading, it becomes darker. And how come? Well, maroon is in the background. So 50% of what I see in the foreground color is leaking in from the background because I have opacity set to 0.5. So be aware that when you use opacity, sometimes that's the look you want. I'm going to remove opacity on the gold color and go back to normal. Now here's some more cool stuff. Remember in an earlier lesson, we mentioned that after every color we can enter the dot gradient modifier. Let's enter a dot gradient right after the dot yellow that we use in our background. Now notice the difference in the corners. The color at the top of the fill is lighter than the color at the bottom of the fill. That's the gradient. A gradient is a transition from one color to another. And this simple gradient, just dot gradient, is Apple's default for setting a very subtle shading of color that in many cases will give your app just a smidge more of that professional edge. Now if the gradient was tough to see, it's more pronounced if we use a color like black. So I'm going to change yellow to black and see how the top is more gray than the bottom, which is completely black. And we can compare this with true black. If we delete the gradient modifier, see the whole screen is true black. And then if we put the gradient modifier after black again, I can see the gray color at the top. Cool. And what's nice about this new simpler gradient is that you can use it on any color, including custom colors. You don't need to state specific colors to transition between. So for example, if I change my rectangle fill color to sky blue, that color that we created earlier, then add the dot gradient modifier after that, look closely and you can see that the gradient has a lighter color toward the top and a full color at the bottom. Very neat. Now just to show you, you can also create more complex gradients, so let's look at some examples of those. And just so you can see the code better, I'm going to put the parentheses of the background modifier on separate lines with a blank line in between. It's totally okay to write your code this way. In fact, it's kind of nice to write it this way if you have lots of parameters and you want each parameter on a separate line so it's easier to read. That's where I'll enter this more complex gradient code. So I'm going to pass in a more complex gradient where I select the colors to transition between. So I'm going to type a capital G gradient between those fill parameters. Notice code completion. I'm going to select the option with colors, and look at code completion. It says it creates a gradient from an array of colors, and we see square brackets with color inside. In an earlier lesson, we learned that arrays are an ordered list of information. We put them between square brackets. We put commas in between the individual values. So I want to create a gradient that goes from orange to yellow. So with gradient colors highlighted, I'm going to press return. Code completion coaches me through the format. Notice it shows square brackets with color inside. I'll type the open square bracket. Xcode types the closing square bracket and positions my cursor between the two. Thank you, Xcode. And now I can enter my colors separated by commas like this, dot orange, comma, dot yellow. Cool, look at that transition. Looks like a flaming sunset. I can switch the order of the colors. Dot yellow, comma, dot orange starts with yellow at the top and orange at the bottom. Then I can add my own colors. So if I get rid of dot yellow and instead pass in dot sky blue, my custom color, and change the second color to dot indigo, I see this transition from sky blue to indigo. Cool. And since arrays can be a collection of any number of colors, I can feel American patriotism and enter dot white, dot blue, dot red. Now make sure you keep the square bracket around the colors, and that's a 3-color gradient. Now none of these gradients were as professionally subtle as the Apple no parameter gradient modifier that I started with, so that's likely the one that you'll use in most circumstances. But if your app ever calls for advanced gradients, here's a look at some different types that are available, and you can research these on your own if you ever need to use them. I'll just pull up some demo code that I wrote. Don't feel like you've got to enter this code yourself. The first gradient is the standard gradient that we just showed. There's also the linear gradient where you can set a start and stop position for the colors. Radial gradients spread out from a point, and angular gradients are sometimes called conical gradients. They transition around a point with the colors in cones or pie shapes. And with that, I think that's enough for this lesson. To prepare for the next lesson, I'm going to get rid of my background modifier and my gradient inside it, and I'm going to delete the You Have Skills text at the top of the view. But once again, Swifter, this lesson was filled with lots of big learning. In this lesson, we reviewed spacers to see how we could push views around our user interface. We learned how to use the SafeArea and how the SafeArea differs across devices that have curved screen edges and islands or notches. We also learned how to override or ignore the SafeArea. We learned about the clip shape with rounded rect and a corner radius, and we used that technique to stop the iOS color bleed. We learned about custom colors, and we created custom colors in the asset catalog using the color picker color wheel, the eyedropper, and RGB values. We learned a couple techniques for setting the background color using ZStacks with a color view and using the background modifier. We reviewed the difference between the background modifier that's used with static views and tint, which is used on interactive views. We also learned about opacity, that's the characteristic that determines a view's transparency, the gradient modifier, and we created a gradient view with a color list, and we learned about various types of advanced gradients. Well, Swifter, your Swifty skills are lining up with precision, and your knowledge is expanding toward dot infinity. I hope you feel good about the time we spend together. I'm grateful for your interest in this course, and there's lots more goodness to come, so keep hacking.